Have you ever wondered what would happen if a lone trucker met a dog in the middle of nowhere? When John stopped for Buddy on a quiet highway, he never imagined his life would change forever. What this dog led him to discover is heartwarming, life-changing, and a lesson in love and loyalty. But first, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories that will touch your heart. The sun hung high in the sky, its heat shimmering over the endless stretch of the highway. John, a middle-aged truck driver with a rugged build and slightly graying hair, squinted against the glare reflecting off the road. His truck roared steadily beneath him, a massive machine built to haul heavy loads carrying goods from California to New York. The rhythmic hum of the engine was a familiar companion, comforting in its constancy as it drowned out the silence of the open road. John loved the solitude that trucking offered, but there were moments like today when the monotony threatened to lull him into a trance. He adjusted his cap and leaned back in his seat, letting the country music station fill the cabin. A classic tune about heartbreak and resilience drifted through the speakers, and he found himself humming along. As he rounded a curve, something unusual caught his eye, a flash of golden fur in the middle of the highway. He squinted, tapping the brakes instinctively, his heart jolting as the shape took form. A golden retriever stood steadfast in the center of the road, its tail wagging furiously. John slammed the brakes, his truck groaning in protest as it screeched to a halt just a few yards away from the dog. The retriever didn't flinch. Instead, it stood there staring directly at him with intelligent eyes that seemed to plead for his attention. "Whoa, boy," John muttered, his heart still racing. He leaned out of the window, eyeing the dog. "What are you doing out here?" The dog wagged its tail harder, almost as if it understood him. Curiosity got the better of him, and John climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching against the gravel on the roadside. The dog trotted over immediately, its bright golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. It nuzzled his hand, its wet nose cool against his calloused palm. "Lost, huh?" John murmured, crouching down to get a closer look. The dog was well-groomed, its fur soft and clean. This wasn't a stray. "Where's your owner?" The dog barked softly, nudging his hand insistently before trotting a few steps ahead and looking back at him. It was clear the animal wanted him to follow. John hesitated. He had a delivery to make, and every minute he spent here put him behind schedule, but something about the dog's urgency tugged at his heart. He sighed, straightened up, and nodded. "All right, boy. Lead the way." The dog took off at a brisk pace, leaving John to scramble back into his truck. He drove slowly, keeping an eye on the retriever as it led him down an unfamiliar dirt road that snaked through a dense forest. The towering trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches filtering sunlight into fragmented beams that danced on the forest floor. The air grew cooler, a welcome relief from the heat of the highway. The road grew narrower, bumpier, as though it hadn't been used in years. John's unease grew with every mile. "Where are you taking me?" he muttered, glancing at the dog, which seemed undeterred, its pace steady and determined. Finally, the road opened into a small clearing, and John saw it, a cabin, old and weathered, standing alone in the middle of the forest. Its wooden walls were gray with age, the paint peeling in jagged strips. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged under the weight of neglect. The scene was haunting, a stark contrast to the lively forest that surrounded it. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing and barked, its tail wagging furiously. John parked his truck and climbed out, his boots crunching on dry leaves. He hesitated, scanning the cabin for any signs of life. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. Then he heard it, a faint muffled cry coming from inside the cabin. It was weak, barely audible, but it was enough to set his heart racing. Someone was in there, and they needed help. John rushed to the door only to find it locked. He pounded on it, shouting, "Is anyone in there? Can you hear me?" The cries grew louder, more desperate. Adrenaline surged through him as he looked around for another way in. Spotting a small, broken window on the side of the cabin, he hurried over. The glass was cracked, jagged edges glinting dangerously in the dappled sunlight. Carefully, he reached through, fumbling for the latch. After a moment of struggle, he managed to unlock the window and push it open. He climbed through the narrow opening, landing with a thud on the dusty wooden floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. His eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light filtering through the boarded-up windows. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "In here," came a weak reply, barely more than a whisper. John followed the sound to a small back room. There, on a makeshift bed of old blankets, lay an elderly woman. Her frail frame was wrapped in a thin, tattered quilt, and her face was pale and drawn. She opened her eyes as he approached, her gaze filled with a mix of confusion and relief. "Who are you?" she rasped. "My name's John," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'm a truck driver. Your dog led me here." The woman managed a faint smile. "That's Buddy," she whispered. "He's my best friend." John glanced at the dog, now sitting loyally at her side, its eyes filled with concern. He could see the bond between them, a connection forged through years of companionship. But the woman was clearly in dire need of medical attention. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was cold to the touch. "Don't worry," he said gently. "I'll get you some help." He scrambled back out of the cabin, Buddy close on his heels, and grabbed his phone from the truck. His hand shook as he dialed 911, explaining the situation as clearly as he could. The operator assured him that an ambulance was on its way. John returned to the woman's side, holding her hand as they waited. Buddy lay down beside her, resting its head on her chest as if to comfort her. In that quiet moment, John felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He didn't know this woman or her story, but he was determined to see her through. When the paramedics arrived, they worked quickly, loading the woman onto a stretcher. Buddy whimpered softly, refusing to leave her side until John coaxed him away with soothing words. As the ambulance pulled away, John stood there with Buddy at his side, staring after it. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would change all their lives. The small hospital waiting room was quiet except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. John sat in a stiff plastic chair, his elbows resting on his knees, and his hands clasped together as he stared at the floor. His truck was parked in the hospital lot, still loaded with goods he needed to deliver, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He glanced at Buddy, who lay obediently at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to nudge John's leg with his nose as if to reassure him. "Good boy," John murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. The golden retriever's tail thumped softly against the floor in response. The door to the emergency ward creaked open and a nurse stepped out. She smiled gently at John. "She's stable now. You can see her if you'd like." John nodded, his chest tightening with relief. He stood, giving Buddy a pat on the head before following the nurse down the hallway. The hospital was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. The nurse stopped at a small room and gestured for John to enter. Inside, Sarah lay propped up in a hospital bed. Her face was still pale, but there was a hint of color in her cheeks now, and her breathing was steady. She turned her head as John entered, a weak smile spreading across her face. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but stronger than it had been in the cabin. "Of course," John replied, pulling a chair close to her bed. "Couldn't just leave you alone after all that." Sarah's gaze shifted to the door, and her smile widened as Buddy trotted in, his tail wagging furiously. The dog immediately went to her bedside, resting his head on the mattress. Sarah reached out with a trembling hand to stroke his fur. "He never left my side," she said, her voice filled with affection. "Even when I got sick, he stayed with me. He must have known I couldn't make it without help." John watched the two of them, a lump forming in his throat. There was something deeply moving about the bond between Sarah and Buddy, a connection that went beyond words. It reminded him of the dog he'd had as a boy, a loyal mutt named Max who had been his constant companion through the highs and lows of childhood. "Sarah," John said after a moment, his voice gentle, "what were you doing out there all alone? That cabin didn't look like the safest place to be." Sarah sighed, her hand stilling on Buddy's head. I've lived there for years. My husband and I bought the land when we were young. It was our dream to build a home in the middle of nowhere, where we could live off the grid and be surrounded by nature. After he passed, well, I just couldn't bring myself to leave. It was all I had left of him. John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. And Buddy? I found him a few years ago wandering near the cabin, Sarah said, her voice softening as she spoke of the dog. He was just a pup, skinny and scared. Took me weeks to gain his trust, but once I did, he never left my side. He's my family. John leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. You're lucky to have him. Not many dogs would have done what he did, leading a stranger like me all that way just to save you. Sarah smiled, her fingers running through Buddy's golden fur. He's special. I don't know what I'd do without him. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Then Sarah turned her gaze back to John. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. You saved my life. Don't thank me, John replied, shaking his head. Buddy's the real hero. I just followed his lead. Sarah chuckled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Well, thank you for listening to him. Most people wouldn't have bothered. John didn't reply. Instead, he looked at Buddy, who seemed to sense the weight of the moment, and leaned closer to Sarah, his eyes filled with unspoken understanding. For the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the long, empty miles of the highway. Over the next few days, John visited Sarah regularly, bringing Buddy along each time. The hospital staff had grown fond of the dog, often stopping to pet him or sneak him treats. John noticed how Sarah seemed to brighten with each visit, her strength returning bit by bit. She told him stories about her life with her husband, her love for the forest, and the many adventures she and Buddy had shared. In turn, John found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about his years on the road, the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite his love for the open highway, and the family he'd lost touch with over the years. Sarah listened with quiet empathy, her presence as comforting as Buddy's warm, steady gaze. One afternoon, as they sat in the hospital garden, Sarah turned to John. I've been thinking, she began hesitantly. I can't go back to the cabin, not in my condition, but I don't know where else to go. John frowned, considering her words. Do you have any family? Sarah shook her head. No one close, just me and Buddy. John glanced at the dog, who was lying at Sarah's feet, chewing contentedly on a stick. He felt a pang of sadness at the thought of Sarah being alone again, especially after everything she'd been through. There's gotta be something we can figure out, he said finally. Let me ask around, see if I can find a place where you and Buddy can stay. Sarah smiled, the worry in her eyes easing slightly. Thank you, John. You don't know how much this means to me. John shrugged, trying to downplay his growing sense of responsibility. It's the least I can do, besides. Buddy would never forgive me if I didn't take care of you. The golden retriever looked up at the sound of his name, his tail thumping against the ground as if in agreement. Sarah laughed, the sound light and joyful, and for the first time since he'd met her, John felt like everything might just work out. John leaned against his truck outside the hospital, staring at the parking lot as the evening sun dipped low on the horizon. He felt a heaviness he couldn't quite shake. Sarah was getting better, but her words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. I can't go back to the cabin. It wasn't just her health. She needed more than a place to recover. She needed a new beginning. Buddy sat at his feet, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. John absent-mindedly reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. What do we do now, boy? He muttered. Buddy wagged his tail slightly, as if encouraging him to keep moving forward. The answer came unexpectedly the next day when John stopped at a bustling farmer's market to grab a bite before hitting the road. He parked his truck on the outskirts of the market and wandered in, drawn by the scent of fresh produce and baked goods. Colorful stalls lined the area, offering everything from ripe fruit to homemade jams and hand-woven baskets. The air buzzed with lively chatter, the kind of warmth and community John rarely experienced on the road. As he browsed, his eyes landed on a stall filled with jars of homemade jam, each neatly labeled in careful handwriting. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with short, curly brown hair streaked with gray. She wore a plaid shirt and an apron dusted with flour, her face lighting up as she greeted customers. "Hello there," she said as John approached, her voice warm and inviting. "Looking for something sweet?" John smiled faintly, picking up a jar of strawberry jam. "This your work?" "Every jar," she replied proudly. "Family recipes passed down for generations. You won't find better anywhere else." He chuckled. "I'll take your word for it." As she handed him the jar, her eyes flicked to Buddy, who was patiently sitting at John's side. "That's a fine dog you've got there," she said. "Golden retriever, right?" "That's right," John replied, patting Buddy's head. "His name's Buddy. He's not mine, though. Belongs to a friend. Kind of a long story." The woman's smile softened. "Sounds like there's a story worth telling." John found himself explaining more than he intended, recounting how Buddy had led him to Sarah, her struggles, and his search for a solution to help her. The woman listened intently, her hands still as she leaned against the counter. "Well," she said when he finished, "it sounds like you've both had quite the journey, and it just so happens I might have an idea." John raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She nodded. "My name's Martha. My husband and I run a small farm just outside of town. We've been looking for someone to help out. We're not as young as we used to be. There's a cottage on the property, cozy but solid, and it's sitting empty. If your friend's looking for a fresh start, maybe this is the place." John blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected generosity. "You'd let her stay there?" Martha smiled. "Well, she'd have to pitch in when she's able. But we could work something out. We're all about community, and it sounds like you and Sarah could use one." He felt a wave of relief mixed with hesitation. "I don't know. I'd have to talk to her about it. But it sounds like a real opportunity." "You think it over," Martha said, sliding him a business card. "The offer's open." John left the market with more than just a jar of jam. As he drove back to the hospital, Buddy resting his head on the passenger seat, he couldn't stop thinking about the farm. The idea of a stable, peaceful life for Sarah, and maybe even himself, was appealing in ways he hadn't expected. That afternoon, he sat with Sarah in the hospital garden, the card from Martha tucked in his pocket. She looked brighter today, her cheeks fuller and her eyes more alert. Buddy lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap as she absently stroked his fur. "How are you feeling?" John asked, leaning back in his chair. "Better," Sarah replied. "The doctors say I'll be discharged soon, but I still don't know where I'll go." John hesitated, then pulled the card from his pocket and handed it to her. "I might have found a place." She read it, her brow furrowing. "A farm?" "A couple runs it," he explained. "They're looking for help, and they've got a cottage that's sitting empty. Martha, the woman I talked to, seemed genuine, said they'd welcome you and Buddy." Sarah looked down at the card, her fingers tracing the edges. "It sounds wonderful, but I don't know if I can do it. A farm is a lot of work, and I'm not as strong as I used to be." "You don't have to do it alone," John said firmly. "Martha said they'd work with you, and Buddy can handle any sheep herding they throw his way." Sarah laughed softly, the sound light and hopeful. "You really think it could work?" "I do," John replied. "It's worth a shot, don't you think?" She nodded slowly, her grip on the card tightening. "Let's do it." The next week after Sarah was discharged, John drove her and Buddy out to the farm. The sun was setting as they arrived, casting a golden glow over the rolling fields. The farmhouse was charming, with a wraparound porch and flower boxes on the windowsills. The cottage, nestled nearby under the shade of a large oak tree, looked like something out of a storybook. Martha met them at the gate, her face lighting up as she saw Buddy leap from the truck. "Welcome," she called out, her husband waving from the porch. "I'm so glad you came." Sarah stepped out slowly, leaning on her cane, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Come on," Martha said, motioning them toward the cottage. "Let's get you settled." Inside, the cottage was cozy and inviting, with a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a bedroom overlooking the fields. Sarah ran her fingers over the wooden table, her expression soft with wonder. "It's perfect," she murmured. Buddy immediately made himself at home, curling up on a rug near the fireplace. John stood in the doorway, watching as Sarah sank into an armchair, a smile spreading across her face. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him, "for everything." He shrugged, trying to downplay the lump in his throat. "Just glad to see you happy." As the evening wore on, John joined Sarah and Martha on the porch, the three of them watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, John felt like he wasn't just passing through. He was part of something. The first morning at the farm dawned with the soft light of sunrise spilling over the rolling hills. Sarah awoke in the small, cozy bedroom of the cottage, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass through the open window. Buddy lay curled up at the foot of her bed, lifting his head as the first rays of light crept across the wooden floor. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah felt at peace. The quiet of the farm was a stark contrast to the isolation of her cabin in the woods. Here, the solitude wasn't empty. It was filled with life. The chirping of birds, the distant bleating of sheep, and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Buddy leapt off the bed as Sarah sat up, his tail wagging furiously. "All right, boy," she said with a chuckle, her voice stronger now. "Let's see what today brings." When Sarah stepped out onto the porch, she found Martha already bustling around the farmhouse. A steaming mug of coffee sat waiting on the porch railing. "Good morning," Martha called out with a bright smile. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah replied, taking the mug gratefully. "Good," Martha said. "We've got plenty to show you today. Breakfast first, then I'll give you a proper tour." As the morning wore on, Sarah followed Martha around the property. The farm was alive with activity. Cows grazed lazily in the fields, chickens clucked contentedly in their coop, and the vegetable garden was bursting with ripe tomatoes, cucumbers, and vibrant herbs. Martha explained the daily routines with enthusiasm, her love for the land evident in every word. "This place thrives on community," Martha said, guiding Sarah toward the garden. "Everyone pitches in where they can. And don't worry, we'll ease you into it." Sarah smiled, her apprehension easing. "I think I'd like to start with the garden," she said, running her fingers over the leaves of a basil plant. "It's been a while, but I used to love working with my hands." "Perfect," Martha replied. "You'll fit right in." Meanwhile, John was busy helping Martha's husband, Henry, repair a section of the barn roof. Perched on a ladder, hammer in hand, John worked with a focus that surprised even himself. He hadn't expected to feel so at home in a place like this, but there was something grounding about the simplicity of the work. "Been a while since you swung a hammer?" Henry asked, chuckling as John paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Longer than I'd care to admit," John replied with a grin. "But it feels good." Henry nodded knowingly. "There's something about working the land that sticks with you. Builds character, keeps you honest." John thought about that as the day went on. He'd spent years on the road, his life measured in miles and deadlines. But here, surrounded by rolling fields and honest labor, he felt a connection to something deeper, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd been missing. By the afternoon, Sarah was in the garden with Buddy at her side, carefully harvesting ripe tomatoes. The dog trotted around the rows of vegetables, his tail wagging as he chased butterflies and occasionally stopped to inspect her work. "You've got quite the helper there," Martha said, leaning against the garden gate with a smile. Sarah laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's always been like this. Never lets me out of his sight." "Well, he's a natural," Martha said, "and so are you. Those tomatoes look perfect." Sarah beamed, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the physical labor or the beauty of the farm. It was the sense of being part of something bigger, something meaningful. Later that evening, the group gathered around a large wooden table on the farmhouse porch for dinner. The table was piled high with dishes made from the farm's own produce, fresh salads, roasted vegetables, and warm, crusty bread. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the fields. "This is what it's all about," Martha said, raising her glass. "Good food, good company, and the joy of knowing you've earned it." Everyone clinked their glasses together, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she belonged. John sat beside her. Buddy curled up at their feet, and she couldn't help but smile at the simple, perfect moment. As the night wore on, John found himself lingering after dinner, sitting on the porch with Henry. The two men talked quietly, their voices blending with the chirping of crickets and the occasional lowing of cows in the distance. "You've got a knack for this," Henry said, gesturing toward the barn. "If you ever get tired of the road, you'd make a fine farmer." John chuckled. "I don't know about that. I'm just a trucker trying to figure things out." "Well," Henry said, leaning back in his chair, "seems to me you've already started. It's not about what you know. It's about what you're willing to learn." John nodded, the words sinking in. He'd spent so much of his life moving, always on to the next town, the next delivery. But here, for the first time, he felt like staying put might be worth considering. Back at the cottage, Sarah sat on the porch swing with Buddy by her side, her gaze fixed on the star-filled sky. She felt the weight of the years lifting, replaced by a quiet hope she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, boy," she whispered, stroking Buddy's fur, "for bringing me here." Buddy licked her hand in response, his tail thumping against the wooden boards of the porch. As the farm settled into the quiet rhythm of the night, John, Sarah, and Buddy all found themselves thinking the same thing. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new, something better than any of them had dared to dream. The days at the farm began to blend into a steady rhythm. Sarah spent her mornings in the garden, tending to rows of tomatoes, peppers, and basil, her hands finding a familiarity with the earth that she hadn't felt in years. Buddy was always nearby, trotting along the garden paths, occasionally startling a bird or butterfly into flight. In the afternoons, she rested on the porch, painting scenes of the farm, rolling hills, grazing cows, and the old barn where John and Henry worked tirelessly to repair its aging structure. John had taken to farm life more naturally than he anticipated. He found satisfaction in the physical work, the kind that left him tired in a good way by the end of the day. It was a stark contrast to the endless highways and truck stops that had defined his life for so long. The camaraderie he shared with Henry was something he hadn't realized he'd missed, and he often found himself staying up late, talking with him under the stars about life choices and the simple joys of the countryside. But as idyllic as life on the farm was becoming, it wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, while Sarah was in the garden and John was helping Henry repair a fence, a black SUV pulled up to the farmhouse. The vehicle stood out against the rustic charm of the farm, its sleek, polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. Martha stepped out onto the porch, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as two sharply dressed men exited the SUV. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. One of the men, tall with neatly combed gray hair, stepped forward, flashing a badge. "I'm Agent Harris, and this is my partner, Agent Miller. We're with the State Health Department. We've been following up on a case involving an elderly woman recently discharged from the hospital, Mrs. Sarah Bennett. We were informed she might be staying here." Martha folded her arms, her gaze narrowing. "She is, and why is that your business?" Agent Harris's tone remained professional. Mrs. Bennett's cabin was flagged as a potential health hazard after the paramedics reported the conditions. We're here to ensure she's settled in a safe and appropriate environment." By now, Sarah had come to the porch, Buddy at her side, his tail low as he sensed the tension. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firm despite the slight tremor. "These people have been more than kind to me." Agent Miller stepped forward, his expression softening. "Mrs. Bennett, we just want to make sure you're getting the care you need. This is about your well-being." John appeared then, his hands dirty from working on the fence, his brow furrowed as he sized up the situation. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's got a roof over her head, good food, and people who care about her." The agents exchanged glances before Agent Harris spoke again. "We don't mean to disrupt anything, but it's our duty to verify her living conditions." Martha stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You're welcome to look around. You'll see she's better cared for here than she ever was alone in that cabin." Reluctantly, the agents agreed. As they inspected the farm, they couldn't help but notice the signs of Sarah's improved health, her steady gait as she walked the garden paths, her laughter as she described Buddy's antics, and the warmth of the community that surrounded her. When the agents finally left, satisfied that Sarah was in good hands, a collective sigh of relief passed through the group. Sarah turned to John and Martha, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." John shrugged, though a small smile tugged at his lips. "Your family now. We take care of our own." As the weeks passed, Sarah began to take on more responsibilities around the farm, finding a sense of purpose in every task. She joined Martha in baking bread and canning vegetables, her confidence growing with each new skill. Buddy, of course, was her constant companion, earning the admiration of everyone on the farm for his loyalty and playful nature. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch painting a particularly vibrant sunset, John approached with a thoughtful expression. "Hey, Sarah," he began, sitting beside her. "I've been thinking about what those agents said." She looked up, her brush still. "What about it?" "They weren't wrong to be concerned," he admitted. "You've come a long way since the cabin, but there's more we can do to make sure you're comfortable here. I was talking to Henry, and we've got plans to renovate the cottage, add a ramp, make the bathroom more accessible, anything you need." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "John, you've already done so much. I can't ask for more." "You didn't ask," he replied simply. "We just want you to feel at home." The renovations began the next day, with John leading the effort. Henry lent his expertise, while Martha and Sarah planned the interior changes. The project became a community affair, with neighbors pitching in to help, bringing tools and materials, and even cooking meals for the workers. By the time the renovations were complete, the cottage had transformed into a space that was not only functional, but also beautiful, a true home. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand over her heart, as she looked around the newly finished space. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. John smiled, his own heart full. "You deserve it." That evening, the farm hosted a celebration. The long wooden table on the porch was laden with dishes, the air filled with laughter and the sound of music from a neighbor's guitar. Sarah sat at the head of the table, surrounded by people who had become her family. Buddy lay at her feet, his tail wagging lazily as he enjoyed the warmth of the gathering. As the stars emerged in the night sky, Sarah looked around at the faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. She reached down to scratch behind Buddy's ears, whispering, "You've done so much for me, boy, more than I ever thought possible." Buddy looked up at her, his eyes shining with devotion, as if to say, "We've done this together." The first frost arrived quietly one morning, painting the farm in silvery hues. Sarah stood on the porch of her cozy cottage, wrapped in a thick shawl, holding a steaming cup of tea. Buddy sat beside her, his nose twitching as he sniffed the crisp air. The farm, now covered in a thin layer of frost, looked serene under the pale light of the rising sun. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the rolling hills and the barn where John and Henry were already hard at work. She couldn't help but marvel at how far she had come. The quiet isolation of her cabin felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth and purpose she had found here. As the day began, the farm buzzed with activity. Martha had invited several neighbors for a community gathering, a chance to celebrate the harvest season and share the bounty of the land. Sarah, with Buddy loyally at her side, spent the morning baking pies and helping Martha prepare the large wooden table on the porch. "You've become quite the baker," Martha teased as Sarah expertly rolled out a pie crust. Sarah chuckled, her cheeks flushing with pride. "I had a good teacher." Buddy barked softly as if agreeing, and Martha laughed. "He's the real boss around here, isn't he?" By afternoon, the farm was alive with guests. Families arrived with baskets of food, children ran through the fields, and neighbors exchanged stories and laughter. John mingled easily, something Sarah had noticed becoming more common. The once solitary trucker had begun to open up, finding a sense of belonging he hadn't known in years. As the gathering unfolded, an unexpected guest arrived. A young woman in her mid-20s, dressed in a casual sweater and jeans, stepped out of a car and approached the group hesitantly. Her auburn hair framed a face that looked both familiar and nervous. John froze mid-conversation, his eyes widening as they met hers. "Emily?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled nervously. "Hi, Dad." A stunned silence fell over the group as John stepped forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and emotion. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice thick with unspoken feelings. I heard about the farm," Emily said, glancing around. "I wanted to see you." John nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he reached out to hug her. It was a moment that spoke volumes, years of distance and hurt dissolving in an instant. Sarah watched from the porch, her heart swelling with emotion. She hadn't known John had a daughter. He had never mentioned her. But seeing them together, she understood why he had seemed so lost before. This was a piece of his life he had been missing. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the farm had settled into a peaceful quiet, John and Emily sat on the porch, talking in low voices. Sarah stayed inside, giving them space, but she could see the flicker of hope in John's eyes every time Emily smiled. When John finally came inside, his expression was softer than Sarah had ever seen. He sank into a chair near the fire, Buddy padding over to rest his head on John's knee. "She's staying for a while," John said, his voice filled with quiet joy. "Wants to get to know me again." Sarah smiled, her hands clasped around her tea. "That's wonderful, John. I'm happy for you." "Thanks," he said, his gaze distant as he processed the evening's events. "I didn't think I'd ever see her again." "Sometimes life surprises us," Sarah said gently, "in the best ways." Over the next few weeks, Emily became a part of the farm's daily life. She helped in the garden, fed the chickens, and even took to painting with Sarah on the porch. The two women formed a fast bond, their laughter often filling the quiet corners of the farm. John, for his part, seemed rejuvenated. He spent every free moment with Emily, teaching her the ins and outs of farm work and sharing stories from his time on the road. It was clear that he was determined to make up for lost time. One chilly evening, as the family sat around the fire pit roasting marshmallows, Emily turned to John. "You seem happy here," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I am," John admitted, glancing at Sarah and Buddy. "This place, it feels like home." Emily smiled. "I can see why. You've built something special here." John nodded, his gaze steady. "We have, and I'm glad you're part of it now." Winter settled over the farm, blanketing the fields in snow and bringing a stillness that felt almost magical. Despite the cold, the warmth of the newfound family filled every corner of the farm. Sarah, John, Buddy, and now Emily had become a unit, each finding strength and purpose in the other. On Christmas morning, the group gathered in the farmhouse, exchanging small, thoughtful gifts. Sarah gave John a painting she had made of the farm at sunset, the colors vibrant and full of life. John gave Emily a carved wooden box he had crafted in the barn, its lid inlaid with a delicate floral pattern. For Buddy, there was a new bed by the fireplace and a basket of treats, which he devoured happily. As he lay by the fire, his tail thumping softly, it was clear he had become the heart of this new family, a constant reminder of loyalty, love, and the power of second chances. As the day faded into evening, Sarah sat by the window of the cottage, looking out at the snow-covered fields. Buddy lay at her feet, his eyes half closed. She reached down to stroke his fur, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for bringing us all together." Buddy's tail wagged once as if he understood.